It took exactly 79 seconds. It wasn't a clean, cinematic blur of choreographed martial arts, but a messy, lung-burning scramble on a sweat-slicked rubber floor. They thought the trident pinned to her record was a political stunt, a concession to modern optics. They thought taking her sidearm made her a victim. By the time the flickering fluorescent lights stopped humming and the dust settled, 4 elite contractors were choking on the floor. Here is exactly how it happened. Concrete holds a specific kind of cold, even in the middle of a desert summer. Cora pressed her forehead against the block wall of the staging bunker, letting the abrasive chill bite into her skin. Her lungs expanded, dragging in air that smelled of diesel exhaust, burning plastic, and the sour tang of week-old sweat. It was 0300 hours. The rest of the forward operating base was either dead asleep or running on the frantic, wired energy of the night watch. Cora was stuck in the purgatory between the two. She peeled her plate carrier off. The Velcro scream echoed too loudly in the hollow room. When the 60 pounds of ballistic gel, ceramic plates and spare magazines finally hit the metal bench, her spine groaned in protest. She rolled her shoulders. Friction burns tracked angry red lines across her collarbones, stinging violently as the sweat began to dry. Cora didn't feel elite. She felt like an overworked mechanic trapped inside a disintegrating machine. Her hands, wrapped in calluses thick as boot leather, unclipped her helmet. She set it next to her gear, the night vision goggles clacking dully against the bench. She ran a hand through her cropped, salt-crusted hair. All she wanted was 12 minutes under the tepid, rust-colored water of the base showers and a cot that didn't smell like mildew. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel outside the bunker. Multiple sets. Not the rhythmic, disciplined march of a patrol returning, but the heavy, drag-heeled saunter of men who felt they owned the perimeter. The heavy steel door shrieked on its hinges, letting in a wedge of harsh yellow floodlight before slamming shut. 4 of them stepped into the dim staging area. Contractors, specifically the private security detail assigned to a State Department asset visiting the FOB. They wore mismatched tactical gear, unbloused khaki pants, and the kind of expensive, lightweight boots that screamed a corporate budget. Cora recognized their type instantly. They were former military, usually Rangers or Marine Recon, guys who had traded the rigid structure of the uniform for lucrative daily rates, relaxed grooming standards, and an inflated sense of superiority. The biggest one, a thick-necked man with a ginger beard and a wad of chewing tobacco pushing his lower lip out, led the pack. His name tape read Knox. Behind him were 3 others, Hayes, Miller, and Davies. They smelled like cheap energy drinks and stale adrenaline. Knox stopped when he saw her. The casual conversation between the 4 men died out, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the same silence Cora had endured for 3 years. The zoo animal silence, the quiet calculation of men trying to figure out if she was lost, if she was support staff, or if she was the anomaly they had heard rumors about. "Look at this," Knox said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the small room. He didn't speak to her. He spoke about her to the men behind him. Guess the VIP lounge was full. Cora didn't look up. She methodically unholstered her Sig Sauer P226, thumbing the magazine release. The heavy metal magazine dropped into her palm with a satisfying snick. She placed it on the table. She pulled the slide back, ejecting the chambered round, which spun through the air and clicked onto the concrete floor. "Evening, boys," Cora said, her voice completely devoid of inflection. She stared at the stripped weapon, her fingers blindly tracing the familiar contours of the slide. Hayes, a leaner man with restless, twitchy eyes, chuckled. "You lost, sweetheart? Comtent is 3 buildings down." I know where I am, Cora replied softly. She reached for a torn rag smelling of solvent. She began wiping down the barrel. She was deliberately slowing her heart rate. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A basic stress inoculation technique. Ignore the noise, clean the weapon, go to sleep. She knows where she is, Hayes, Knox mocked, taking a slow step closer to her bench. His boots scuffed the concrete. She's one of those new initiatives, the social experiments. Cora scrubbed the solvent rag harder against the steel. The caustic chemical smell flared in her nostrils, momentarily overpowering the stench of the men. She hated this part. The actual combat was simple. The deployments, the water torture, the sleep deprivation. Those were physical equations. You put in the pain, you got the result. But this endless grating friction in the locker rooms, the armories, the mess halls. This was a psychic bleed that never scabbed over. Miller, leaning against the doorframe, crossed his arms. I heard they modified the O-course, put a little step stool up for the wall climb. Davies laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. Cora closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She felt a familiar, ugly knot tightening just beneath her sternum. It wasn't rage. Rage was hot and loud. This was a cold, tired exhaustion that begged to be set loose. But she knew the rules. If she snapped, if she even raised her voice, she wouldn't be Cora defending herself. She would be the female SEAL who couldn't handle the pressure. She was an ambassador for a gender, a burden she never asked for. If you need the bench, I'll be done in 2 minutes, Cora said, keeping her gaze locked on the disassembled pieces of her sidearm. Her tone was strictly professional, painfully polite. Knox took another step. He was entirely inside her personal space now. She could smell the wintergreen dip on his breath, mixed with dehydration. We don't need the bench, Knox said softly. He reached out with a thick, calloused hand. Cora froze. Knox didn't touch her. Instead, his thick fingers clamped down on the frame of her Sig Sauer resting on the table. He picked it up, weighing it in his hand, looking down the empty barrel with a lazy, careless arrogance. Heavy, Knox noted, turning the gun sideways. You handle this okay with those little wrists? Cora's hands stopped moving. The rag dropped to the bench. She looked at Knox for the first time. His eyes were pale blue, bloodshot, and crinkled with a bullying amusement. He wasn't looking at a fellow operator. He was looking at a trespasser. Put it down, Knox, Cora said. The polite neutrality was gone, replaced by a flat, dead calm. It was a tone she usually reserved for uncooperative detainees. Or what? Hayes chimed in, stepping up beside Knox. You gonna write a grievance? Call HR. Cora calculated the variables. 4 men, all likely north of 200 pounds, all carrying the residual, jittery aggression of a high-threat deployment with no actual trigger pulling. They were bored, they were frustrated, and she was a convenient target, a manifestation of everything they thought was ruining their sacred, masculine fraternity. You violate armory protocol by touching another operator's weapon, Cora said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into a raspy whisper. Put the frame down. Knox grinned. The dip in his lip made his smile lopsided and grotesque. Operator, right. He looked back at his friends. Hey, you guys hear that? We got an operator here. Miller pushed off the doorframe, sensing the escalation, enjoying it. Davies shifted his weight, cracking his knuckles in a cliché display that made Cora's stomach turn with sheer boredom. I heard the washout rate for your class was rigged, Knox said, turning back to her. He held the gun just out of her reach. I heard the instructors had a mandate from DC. Somebody had to pass, had to be a girl. Believe whatever helps you sleep at night, Cora said. She slowly pushed herself up from the bench. Her joints popped. She stood at 5'9". Knox had at least 5 inches and 80 pounds on her. He loomed over her, blocking the fluorescent light. I sleep fine, Knox whispered. Because I know my guys earned their trident. They bled for it. They didn't get it handed to them for a photo op. Cora's jaw clenched. Her back teeth ground together with a faint click. The bureaucratic nightmare of a physical altercation flashed through her mind. The endless debriefs, the smirking JAG officers, the inevitable headlines. Female SEAL involved in brawl with allied contractors. It was a career ender. All she had to do was walk away. Let them have the gun, report it to the base commander in the morning. She looked at the door. Miller and Davies were blocking it. "Hand me the weapon," Cora said. Knox chuckled. He casually tossed the metal frame of the SIG over his shoulder. It clattered loudly against the concrete floor, sliding into a dark corner next to a pile of dirty sandbags. Cora didn't flinch, but her eyes tracked the movement. "Oops," Knox said, feigning a clumsy shrug. Butterfingers. A heavy, suffocating tension flooded the bunker. The ambient hum of the generators outside seemed to fade out, leaving only the sound of 5 people breathing. Cora stared at the empty space on the bench where her gun had been. "You rely too much on the hardware anyway," Knox said, taking a half-step closer. His chest almost brushed hers. The smell of his wintergreen dip was overpowering now. "Take away the gun, take away the body armor. What are you? Just a liability?" Cora looked up into his pale, bloodshot eyes. The exhaustion that had been weighing her down suddenly evaporated, burned away by a cold, crystalline focus. The internal contradiction resolved itself. She shouldn't fight. It was a terrible idea. It was exactly what they wanted. But as she stared at the smirking contractor, a dark, venomous realization settled in her gut. If I walk out that door, they win forever. Every time they see me, every time they see a woman in uniform, they will remember the one who backed down. "You want to know what I am?" Cora asked. Her voice was barely a breath. Knox leaned in, a condescending smirk plastering his face. "Show us then, SEAL. No guns, just you." Cora exhaled. Cora didn't strike Knox first. That was the mistake most people made. They attacked the biggest threat head-on. Knox was braced. Knox was expecting it. Instead, Cora pivoted sharply on her left heel, turning her back to Knox entirely. Hayes, who was standing just to her right, had his weight shifted onto his back foot, laughing at Knox's joke. He wasn't prepared. Cora dropped her center of gravity. Her right arm shot out, not as a punch, but rigid like a steel bar. The heel of her hand connected flush with the soft cartilage of Hayes's throat. It wasn't a killing blow, but the impact was sickeningly precise. Hayes's laugh choked off into a wet gag. His hands flew to his neck. Before he could even step back, Cora stepped into his space, grabbing the back of his tactical vest. She used his own staggering momentum, pivoting her hips and pulling him violently forward. She brought her knee up in a vicious, short arc. Crack! Her knee collided with the bridge of Hayes's nose. A spray of warm, metallic crimson misted across her cheek. Hayes went completely limp, dropping to the concrete floor like a sack of wet cement. 12 seconds. The bunker erupted into chaos. The smug grins vanished. "You crazy bitch!" Miller yelled, lunging forward from the door. Cora didn't have time to reset her stance. Davies was moving in simultaneously from the left, 2 at once. It was sloppy, uncoordinated aggression. She backpedaled, kicking a heavy steel ammo can directly into Miller's path. Miller tripped, his heavy boots tangling. He stumbled forward. Cora sidestepped, grabbing the back of Miller's head as he fell past her. She didn't try to punch him. She just guided his head with brutal velocity directly into the sharp edge of the metal bench. A hollow, wet thunk echoed in the room. Miller crumpled, his body folding awkwardly onto the floor, out cold. 31 seconds, Davies hesitated. That split second of fear was his undoing. He looked at Miller bleeding on the bench, then at Cora. In that microsecond, Cora closed the distance. But she slipped. A pool of Hayes's blood slickened the concrete. Her left boot gave out. Davies saw his opening. He swung a wild, heavy right hook. Cora managed to duck slightly, but the blow caught her high on the cheekbone. The impact was like a cinder block hitting her face. White light flashed behind her eyes. Her teeth clicked together painfully, and a sharp ring pierced her right ear. She stumbled sideways, her vision blurring for a fraction of a second. Davies, emboldened, stepped in to grab her. Cora didn't retreat. She forced herself forward, inside his reach. She jammed her left forearm hard into the crook of Davies's neck, pinning him against the concrete wall. He gasped, grabbing at her arm. With her free right hand, she delivered 3 short, piston-like elbows directly to his ribcage. Bone yielded with a sickening crunch on the third strike. Davies screamed, a high, thin sound, and doubled over. Cora grabbed a fistful of his hair, yanked his head down, and brought her elbow up in a brutal uppercut under his jaw. His eyes rolled back, and he slid down the wall, leaving a smear of dirt and sweat on the grey blocks. 58 seconds. Cora spat a mouthful of metallic blood onto the floor. She was breathing heavily now, the air whistling through her teeth. Her chest heaved. The adrenaline was a toxic fire in her veins. 3 down, 1 left. She turned slowly. Knox was still standing by the bench. His face was completely drained of colour. The arrogant, bullying swagger had vanished, replaced by the primitive, wide-eyed stare of prey, realizing it was locked in a cage with a predator. He looked at his 3 men groaning and bleeding on the floor. "You?" Knox stammered, raising his hands, half in a fighting stance, half in surrender. Cora didn't say a word. She wiped a streak of Hayes's blood off her cheek with the back of her bruised hand. She took a step toward him. Knox roared, a desperate, angry sound, and charged. He was huge, moving with the terrifying speed of a panicked animal. He didn't throw a punch, he tackled her. His massive shoulder hit her midsection, driving the breath from her lungs. They slammed onto the concrete floor in a tangle of limbs. The impact jarred Cora's spine. Knox ended up on top, straddling her chest, his heavy hands going straight for her throat. His fingers were thick, digging into her windpipe. He smelled of sweat, terror, and wintergreen. Cora couldn't breathe. Black spots began to dance at the edge of her vision. She didn't panic. She didn't flail. She went to work. Her legs were free. She bucked her hips upward with explosive violence, bridging her back. Knox's weight shifted forward, his balance breaking. As he tipped over her head, Cora brought her right arm up, snaking it over his left arm and trapping it tight against her body. With her left hand, she reached across, digging her thumb viciously into the soft bundle of nerves under his jawline. Knox yelped, his grip on her throat loosening instinctively. Cora used the opening. She scissored her legs around his waist, locking her ankles. She torqued her body to the right, sweeping him over. The momentum flipped them. Now she was on top. Knox thrashed blindly, his massive strength threatening to buck her off. Cora didn't try to outmuscle him. She slid her left arm under his chin, wrapping her bicep tight against his carotid artery. She clamped her right hand onto her own left bicep, placing her right hand behind Knox's head. a rear-naked choke, but applied from the front mount, messy and desperate. Knox thrashed harder. His boots kicked violently against the floor. His hands clawed at her forearm, leaving deep, bloody scratches. Cora squeezed. She dropped her head next to his ear, protecting her face from wild strikes, driving her hips down to flatten him out. She squeezed with everything she had. All the exhaustion, all the indignity, all the quiet rage of the last 3 years funneled into the muscles of her arms and back. "Shh," Cora whispered, her voice rough and breathy. It wasn't a comforting sound. It was the chilling, mechanical hiss of a valve shutting off. Knox's face turned violently red, then mottled purple. The chewing tobacco spilled from his slackening lips. His thrashing slowed. His hands stopped clawing, dropping weakly to the floor. His eyes fluttered shut. Cora held the choke for 3 seconds past the point of unconsciousness, just to be absolutely sure. Then she let go. Knox's heavy head lolled onto the concrete with a dull thud. Cora sat back on her heels. The room was perfectly silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the ragged, desperate sound of her own breathing. She looked at the digital watch on her left wrist. The glass face was cracked. 79 seconds. She pushed herself up slowly. Her legs felt like lead. Her cheek throbbed fiercely where Davies had hit her. She walked over to the dark corner, knelt down, and picked up the steel frame of her Sig Sauer. She carried it back to the bench, picked up the solvent rag, and continued cleaning the weapon as if nothing had interrupted her. Concrete is an unforgiving canvas. The staging bunker looked like the inside of an abattoir. Hayes was the first to make a sound. It started as a wet, clicking noise in the back of his throat, escalating into a violent, hacking cough. He rolled onto his side, spitting a thick rope of dark blood onto the floor. His nose was flattened against his face, shifted entirely to the left. Both of his eyes were already swelling shut, the bruised flesh turning the color of crushed plums. Miller hadn't moved. He lay in a crumpled heap near the heavy steel bench, a steady trickle of crimson spider webbing from his hairline down into the collar of his tactical shirt. Davies was awake but trapped in a silent panic. He was propped against the block wall, his face the color of wet ash. His right arm was wrapped protectively around his crushed ribs. Every time he tried to draw a breath, his mouth opened in a silent, agonized oval, and a faint wheeze escaped his grey lips. And then there was Knox. The giant lay flat on his back, his massive chest rising and falling in erratic, jerky heaves. The mottled purple had faded from his face, replaced by a sickly, sweating pallor. He blinked slowly, staring at the corrugated tin ceiling as if trying to remember how he got there. He tried to swallow, winced, and weakly reached a hand up to touch his bruised trachea. Cora watched them without an ounce of pity. She also watched them without a shred of triumph. The victory tasted like ash. This was the contradiction she lived in every single day. She had defended herself. She had survived. But in the eyes of the institution, in the eyes of the men who would read the inevitable incident report, she had lost. She had descended to their level. She had proven that she was a disruptive element in a finely tuned machine. They would not see 4 men attacking a woman. They would see a woman who couldn't de-escalate, a woman who brought locker room drama into a combat zone. A heavy, rhythmic thumping echoed outside the bunker. Boots, someone moving fast. Cora didn't move. She kept her hands tucked tightly under her arms, clamping her jaw shut to keep her teeth from chattering. The chill deep in her bones was absolute. The heavy steel door swung open, hitting the exterior concrete wall with a loud, ringing bang. Master at arms. Chief Gallagher stepped into the doorway, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his holstered M9. He was a fireplug of a man, built like a brick wall, with a greying high and tight, and eyes that had seen 20 years of bad decisions across 3 continents. 2 junior base security personnel filed in right behind him, their rifles held at the low ready. Gallagher froze. His eyes swept the room. He saw Hayes blowing bloody bubbles onto the floor. He saw Miller's unconscious form. He saw Davies clutching his ribs, weeping silently. He saw Knox, a 240-pound killing machine, staring blankly at the ceiling. Finally, Gallagher's eyes found Cora. She was sitting on the corner of the bench, bathed in the harsh yellow light of the overhead fluorescents. Her plate carrier was neatly stacked beside her helmet. Her weapon was assembled, wiped clean, and resting in its holster. Aside from the swelling bruise high on her right cheekbone and a smear of someone else's blood across her jaw, she looked entirely undisturbed. The silence in the bunker stretched, taut and fragile. The junior MAs looked completely bewildered, their eyes darting between the massive, broken men on the floor and the solitary woman sitting on the bench. "Chief," Cora said. Her voice was steady, though it lacked its usual resonance. Gallagher slowly took his hand off his weapon. He let out a long, heavy exhale through his nose, sounding like a tired bull. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't demand an immediate explanation. He had been around long enough to read the geometry of the room. He saw the dip spit on the floor near Cora's boots. He saw the scuff marks where Knox had charged. He saw the cold, dead exhaustion in the female operator's eyes. "Petty officer," Gallagher said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stepped entirely into the room, gesturing for his juniors to lower their weapons. "Are you in need of immediate medical attention?" "Negative, Chief." "Are any of these men dead?" Cora glanced at the floor. "No, but Miller needs a spinal board. He hit the bench hard. Davies has at least 3 fractured ribs. Hayes needs a plastic surgeon." Gallagher nodded slowly. He keyed the radio strapped to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Gallagher. I need a medical transport to Bunker 4. Multiple traumas. Bring the stretchers." He released the button and looked back at Cora. "You want to tell me what this is?" "A breach of armory protocol," Cora replied flatly. "Contractor Knox handled my weapon without authorization. The situation devolved." Gallagher looked at Knox, who was finally managing to sit up, rubbing his throat and looking at Cora with a mixture of hatred and profound, shaking terror. "Devolved," Gallagher repeated softly. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a small, waterproof notebook. "Right. Well, you're coming with me, Petty Officer. We're going to medical, and then you and I are going to sit in a very quiet room until the sun comes up." Cora nodded. She uncrossed her arms, forcing her trembling hands to behave as she picked up her plate carrier. Her ribs ached where Knox had slammed into her. Her cheek throbbed with a hot, rhythmic pulse. She walked past Gallagher, stepping carefully over Hayes's legs. She didn't look back at the contractors. They were already ghosts to her. The real fight was just beginning. Fluorescent light in a military medical bay possesses a harsh, unforgiving quality that strips away any illusion of dignity or heroics. It is an honest light. It highlights every scuff on the linoleum floor, every rust spot on the stainless steel instrument trays, and the deep, bruised purple blooming across Cora's right cheekbone. The air smelled violently of iodine, rubbing alcohol and bleached sheets. It was a sterile, clinical scent that always made the back of Cora's throat tighten. Doc Stanton was a man entirely devoid of bedside manner. He was a career Navy corpsman, 50 years old, with deep bags under his eyes and a coffee stain on his faded green scrubs. He didn't care about politics, gender integration, or special operations law. He cared about bone density, pupillary response, and getting back to his rack. "Look straight ahead," Stanton ordered. Cora stared at the blank white wall. Stanton clicked a small pen light and flashed it sharply into her right eye, then her left. "Pupils are equal and reactive," he muttered, turning away to scribble on a clipboard. "No concussion, though God knows how, given the size of the knuckle-dragger who hit you." Cora didn't respond. She sat on the edge of the examination table, the crinkly paper beneath her thighs tearing slightly as she shifted her weight. She had stripped down to her olive-drab t-shirt and uniform trousers. Her knuckles were raw and scraped, tiny beads of dried blood dotting her cuticles. Stanton walked back over with a small pen-sized flashlight and a tongue depressor. "Open." She opened her mouth. Stanton shone the light inside. "Bite down, hard." She did. A sharp spike of pain shot up through her jaw into her ear. She winced involuntarily. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Stanton grunted, tossing the depressor into a red biohazard bin. "Microfracture in the jawline, nasty bone bruise. You're going to be eating soft chow for a week, and your cheek is going to swell up like a rotten grapefruit by morning." "I'm fine, Doc," Cora said. Her voice sounded thicker than usual, the swelling already affecting her articulation. "You're medically cleared for duty, if that's what you mean," Stanton corrected, turning his back to her to wash his hands at a small steel sink. "But you aren't fine. Your resting heart rate is 85. Usually you SEALs sit around 50. You're still dumping cortisol. You're going to crash hard in about 2 hours. I suggest you find a dark corner and stay there." Cora looked down at her hands. They had finally stopped shaking, but her fingers felt stiff, like they belonged to someone else. She slipped off the examination table. The cold linoleum seeped through her socks. She walked over to the small, scratched mirror hanging above the sink. She didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. Her hair was matted to her forehead with dried sweat and dust. The right side of her face was distorted, the skin tight and shiny over the swelling bruise. Her eyes, usually a sharp, observant hazel, looked flat and exhausted, framed by dark, bruised exhaustion. This was the psychic bleed. She had spent 3 years meticulously cultivating an image of impenetrable professionalism. She never swore. She never raised her voice. She never showed pain. She had to be better, faster, and smarter than every man in the room just to be considered fundamentally adequate. She had built a fortress around her emotions, a wall of pure, crystalline discipline. In 79 seconds, she had torn it all down. She had let the anger win. The brutal animal satisfaction she felt when Knox's eyes rolled back in his head, that dark, venomous joy, scared her more than the men ever could. It meant she was exactly what they thought she was. A volatile element, a human being who could be pushed to the breaking point. "They're patching up the contractors down the hall," Stanton said quietly. He was drying his hands on a paper towel, watching her reflection in the mirror. Cora didn't look away from her own battered face. "How bad?" "The one with the broken nose. Hayes. He's going to need surgery. You shattered the cartilage. Davies is wrapped up with 4 cracked ribs. Miller has a minor concussion. And the big guy—" Stanton paused, tossing the paper towel into the trash. "Knox has burst blood vessels in both eyes from the choke. He can barely swallow. He's claiming you attacked them unprovoked." Cora let out a short, hollow laugh. It hurt her jaw. "Of course he is." Gallagher pulled the exterior security cam footage, Stanton added, leaning against the counter. "Doesn't show the inside of the bunker, but it shows 4 armed men going in, and 5 minutes later, it shows them being carried out on stretchers." The optics, petty officer, are messy. I know, Doc. You want some advice from an old man who has seen too many careers die in this sandbox. Cora finally turned away from the mirror to look at him. Always. Don't defend yourself, Stanton said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. When you go into that debriefing room, do not try to explain why you did it. Don't talk about how they provoked you. Don't talk about the culture. Don't talk about fairness. Cora frowned. Why? Because the moment you try to justify it, you're admitting it was an emotional response, Stanton said. You're giving them the narrative. You're making it about a woman feeling threatened by men. They will eat you alive for that. Stanton stepped closer, pointing a blunt finger at her chest. You are an operator. Act like a machine. You neutralized a threat to an armory asset. Period. You used proportional force against multiple hostile contacts. Make it clinical. Make it boring. Give them nothing to hold on to. Cora absorbed the words. The sheer cynicism of it coated her tongue like a bad taste. She couldn't tell the truth, that she was tired of being hunted, tired of being treated like a zoo animal, tired of the relentless, grinding misogyny. She had to strip away her humanity entirely to survive the bureaucracy. She had to become the cold, unfeeling robot they accused her of being. Clinical, Cora repeated, the word tasting like lead. Get dressed, petty officer, Stanton said softly, turning his back to give her privacy. Commander Briggs is waiting for you in the TOC. Bureaucracy has a smell. It is the scent of ozone from overheating laser printers, stale black coffee sitting on a warming plate for 6 hours, and the starchy, chemical stiffness of pressed uniforms that haven't seen the outside of a wire perimeter in months. Commander Briggs inhabited this smell perfectly. The Tactical Operations Center, TOC overflow room, was a retrofitted shipping container. The walls were lined with cheap, wood veneer folding tables and plastic chairs. A single air conditioning unit rattled violently in the window, blasting freezing air directly onto the back of Cora's neck. She sat rigidly in a plastic chair, her hands resting flat on her thighs. Her dress uniform wasn't required for a forward operating base debrief, but she had changed out of her sweaty, blood-stained combat shirt into a clean, pressed desert blouse. The collar felt tight against her bruised jaw. Commander Briggs sat across from her. He was a lean, angular man with thinning silver hair and a deeply lined face. He was an administrative officer, a man who fought his wars with spreadsheets, operational risk assessments, and political maneuvering. He looked at Cora with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep irritation. Also in the room was a civilian. He wore a rumpled tan suit, a blue button-down shirt with no tie, and heavy-framed glasses. He sat in the corner, furiously typing on a ruggedized laptop. State Department. The handler for the VIP the contractors were assigned to protect. Petty officer, Briggs began, his voice a perfectly modulated drone. He stared at an open manila folder on the table between them. I have just spent the last 45 minutes on a secure line with the regional director of a private military company that currently holds a $300 million contract with the United States government. Cora said nothing. She kept her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall exactly 2 inches above Briggs's left shoulder. The director, Briggs continued, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table, is highly distressed. He is under the impression that one of our elite special warfare operators initiated an unprovoked, highly violent assault on his security detail. A detail, I might add, that is critical to a diplomatic mission, arriving at this FOB in less than 12 hours. Briggs paused, letting the silence hang in the freezing air. He wanted her to feel it. He wanted her to be nervous, to start talking, to start making excuses. Stanton's words echoed in her mind. Make it clinical. Make it boring. I was securing my weapon, Commander, Cora said flatly. Her voice was devoid of emotion, a flat line on a heart monitor. Briggs sighed, rubbing his temples. Securing your weapon by putting 4 men in the trauma ward. Contractor Knox entered the staging bunker and forcefully took possession of the lower receiver of my primary sidearm, Cora recited, staring blankly ahead. This is a direct violation of FOB Armory Protocol, Section 4, Paragraph B. When ordered to return the weapon, he refused. When I attempted to retrieve it, the contractor initiated physical contact. The State Department civilian stopped typing and looked up, adjusting his glasses. Wait a minute. Knox says you snapped. He says he just picked up the gun to look at it, and you went crazy. Cora slowly shifted her gaze to the civilian. Her dead, bruised eyes locked onto his. The weapon was stripped for maintenance. The contractor removed it from my immediate control. Given the contractor's aggressive posture and the presence of 3 other individuals blocking the exit, I assessed a critical threat to base security. I neutralized the threat to regain control of the lethal asset. Neutralized, Briggs scoffed, shaking his head. You shattered a man's face. You broke another man's ribs. You choked a 240-pound man completely unconscious. I used proportional force to mitigate a multiple attacker scenario, Cora replied, her tone unyielding. I ceased physical escalation the moment the threat was neutralized. I then finished cleaning the weapon and awaited base security. Briggs leaned back in his chair. The plastic creaked loudly in the cold room. He stared at her, really looked at her, for a long minute. He saw the massive bruise on her face. He saw the cold, detached professionalism she was hiding behind. He hated it. He hated it because it was perfect. She wasn't acting like a victim. She wasn't acting like an emotional wreck. She was quoting protocol, utilizing sterile engagement terminology, and daring him to prove otherwise. Do you understand the political nightmare you have created? Briggs asked softly, dropping the formal tone. These contractors, they are untouchable. If we push this, if we start an official JAG inquiry, they will drag your name through the mud. They will say you're unstable. They will say the female integration program is a failure. Congressmen will be making statements about this by Tuesday. I understand, Commander. Do you? Briggs snapped, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his bureaucratic veneer. Because if I write this up as a mutual altercation, if you accept a formal reprimand for conduct unbecoming, the State Department will smooth it over. The contractors get shipped out quietly. No inquiry, no headlines. It was a trap, a beautifully constructed, deeply cynical trap. If she accepted a reprimand, she was admitting fault. She was permanently staining her record to protect the reputation of the men who attacked her, and to protect the commander from a headache. It was the easy way out for everyone. Everyone except her. Cora felt the phantom pressure of Knox's thick fingers on her throat. She remembered the smell of his wintergreen dip, the mocking laughter of the other men. She remembered the sheer, suffocating weight of the dust in that bunker. She looked at Commander Briggs. The internal contradiction vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She had played their game for 3 years. She had smiled politely. She had swallowed the insults. She had tried to be invisible. But invisibility hadn't protected her. It had only made her a target. I respectfully decline the reprimand, Commander, Cora said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the same raspy whisper she had used on Knox. Briggs blinked, clearly caught off guard. You're refusing the deal? There is no deal to refuse, sir, Cora said, leaning slightly forward, finally making direct eye contact with the officer. I acted in accordance with standard operating procedure regarding the defense of a weapons system. If the contractors wish to pursue an inquiry, I welcome it. The State Department civilian let out a low whistle. "They'll destroy you, petty officer." Cora didn't look at the civilian. She kept her eyes locked on Briggs. "Let them try," she said softly. Briggs stared into her eyes. He was looking for arrogance, or foolish pride, or misplaced bravado. He found none of it. He saw the hollow, exhausted stare of an operator who had already crossed the line and realized there was no going back. He saw a predator sitting in a cheap plastic chair. For the first time since she had arrived at the FOB, Briggs didn't see a political initiative, or a social experiment, or a headache. He saw exactly what her trident said she was. Briggs slowly closed the manila folder. He dragged a heavy hand over his face, suddenly looking incredibly old. The rattling air conditioner kicked off with a loud clank, leaving the room in a heavy, suffocating silence. "Get out of my office, petty officer," Briggs whispered, staring at the closed folder. Cora stood up. Her joints popped, her ribs screamed. She executed a perfect, crisp salute, turned on her heel, and walked out the door. The steel door closed heavily behind her, locking her out into the freezing desert night. The battle in the bunker was over, but the war had only just begun. Her containerized housing unit, a glorified tin can baked by the sun during the day and frozen by the wind at night, sat at the far edge of the officer and senior enlisted billets. Reaching it felt like a grueling overland march. Every step jarred the bruised cartilage in her ribs. Her face was a localized epicenter of radiating heat and sharp, throbbing pain. She keyed the combination lock on the aluminum door. Her fingers fumbled on the cold metal dials. 3 tries. On the third, the lock clicked, and she pushed the heavy door open, stepping into the stale, cramped darkness of her quarters. She didn't turn on the overhead fluorescent. She couldn't handle the harshness of it. Instead, she clicked on a small, red-lens tactical flashlight sitting on her footlocker. The dim, crimson glow washed over the tiny room, illuminating the stark reality of her existence. A tightly made rack, a pile of tactical gear, and a metal locker. Taking off her boots was an exercise in calculated agony. Bending over compressed her chest, sending a sharp, electrical spike of pain from her sternum wrapping around to her spine. She hissed through her teeth, a sharp intake of breath that tasted faintly of the iodine still lingering in her nasal passages from the medical bay. She kicked the heavy, dust-caked boots into the corner. They hit the metal wall with a dull thud. Next came the uniform. The desert blouse smelled of old sweat, weapon solvent, and the sharp, coppery tang of Hayes's blood. She peeled it off, tossing it onto the floor. She stripped down to bare skin, standing in the red-lit chill of the CHU, shivering violently. She grabbed a thin, scratchy towel and walked down the corrugated metal hallway to the communal showers. The water pressure in the FOB was notoriously terrible. It spat from the rusted showerhead in a weak, sputtering stream, smelling heavily of chlorine and oxidized iron. Cora stood directly beneath it, letting the tepid water run over her scalp. The water hit the open scratches on her forearms, where Knox's fingernails had desperately gouged into her skin, and flared with a bright, stinging heat. She pressed her palms against the slippery, mildew-stained shower tiles, bowing her head. The silence of the running water was deafening. This was the exact moment the emotional dam was supposed to break. This was the cinematic beat where the battered hero slides down the wall and weeps. But the tears didn't come. Cora closed her eyes, searching for the grief, searching for the sorrow of being so profoundly isolated. She found nothing but a cold, calcified rage. She picked up a bar of harsh, industrial soap and began to scrub. She scrubbed her hands first, digging her fingernails into her palms. washing away the invisible residue of the contractors. She washed the dried blood from her jaw, flinching as her fingers grazed the swollen, tender mass on her right cheekbone. Doc Stanton had been right. It felt like a rotten piece of fruit beneath her skin. When she finally turned the water off, the chill of the concrete shower block hit her like a physical blow. She wrapped the inadequate towel around her shoulders and walked back to her CHU. Sitting on the edge of her rack, she stared at her hands in the red light. A heavy knock rattled her aluminum door. Cora froze. Her right hand dropped instinctively towards the holster that wasn't on her hip. She took a slow, painful breath, stood up, and pulled a clean olive-drab t-shirt over her head. "Yeah," she called out, her voice raspy and thick. The door creaked open just enough to let in a wedge of pale moonlight. O'Connor stood in the frame. He was the heavy weapons specialist for her detachment, a towering man from South Boston who communicated primarily in grunts, chewing tobacco spit, and sustained bursts of Mk-48 machine gun fire. He was wearing grey sweatpants and a dark hoodie, a lit cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. He didn't step inside. He just stood there, his eyes adjusting to the red gloom of her room. He looked at the massive purple swelling taking over the right side of her face. He looked at the way she was holding her right arm tight against her ribs. O'Connor took a slow drag from his cigarette. The cherry flared bright orange, illuminating the deep, exhausted lines around his eyes. "Heard a rumor," O'Connor said. His voice was a low rumble, barely louder than the idling generators outside. "Rumors happen," Cora replied carefully. She didn't know where O'Connor stood. In the 3 months they had been deployed together, he had spoken perhaps 50 words to her. He didn't actively participate in the locker room garbage, but he had never stopped it either. "Heard 4 of the State Department shooters are sitting in the med bay," O'Connor continued, exhaling a plume of blue smoke into the cold desert air. "Heard one of them is breathing through a tube." Cora shifted her weight. "Your point, O'Connor." He looked down at the metal grating under his boots, then back up at her. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped square. He tossed it lightly. Cora caught it with her left hand. It was a chemical ice pack, the kind stolen from the medical supply tent. "Break the inner pouch," O'Connor said quietly. "Keep it on the jaw for 20 minutes, then off for 20. Helps with the swelling." Cora looked at the small silver packet in her hand. The gesture was so violently unexpected that for a fraction of a second, the cold rage in her chest faltered. "Thanks," she managed to say. O'Connor nodded once. He took a final drag of his cigarette, flicked the butt out into the gravel darkness, and turned to walk away. He paused mid-stride, looking back over his massive shoulder. "Knox is a loud mouth," O'Connor muttered. "Always has been. Good to see someone finally shut him the fuck up. Get some sleep, Cora." He didn't call her petty officer. He didn't call her SEAL. He used her name. It was the first time any of them had. The door clicked shut. Cora sat back down on her rack. She squeezed the ice pack until the inner pouch popped, a sudden freezing chemical reaction spreading through the gel. She pressed it gingerly against her ruined cheek, laid back on the thin mattress, and stared at the corrugated ceiling. Dawn in the desert does not arrive with grace. It detonates. The sun breaches the horizon like a flare, immediately bleaching the sky into a harsh, colorless white and baking the dust until it smells like burnt flint. At 06:30, the forward operating base was fully awake. The rhythmic thumping cadence of helicopter rotors chopped at the thick morning air. The low, grinding rumble of heavily armored MRAPs moving out of the motor pool vibrated up through the soles of Cora's boots. She walked toward the mess hall. She was dressed in her standard combat uniform, her sleeves rolled up precisely below the elbow. She had foregone the plate carrier for the walk, but the heavy fabric of her blouse still felt like sandpaper against her bruised ribs. Her face was a disaster. The swelling had worsened overnight. The right side of her face was distended, the skin pulled taut and shining with a sickening palette of deep violet, sickly yellow and mottled black. Her right eye was entirely swollen shut, forcing her to rely on a compromised, monocular field of vision. She looked exactly like someone who had survived a car crash. As she pulled open the heavy wooden door of the mess hall, the overwhelming wall of sound, 200 personnel eating, shouting over the generators, clattering metal trays, hit her. She stepped inside. The acoustic shift was immediate and incredibly jarring. It didn't happen all at once. It spread like a wave moving outward from the door. The table of Marines nearest the entrance went quiet first, elbowing each other and staring. Then the aviation mechanics. Then the intelligence analysts. Within 10 seconds, a room that had been deafeningly loud was reduced to the muffled clinking of silverware and the hum of the industrial refrigerators. Every single pair of eyes was locked on her. Cora kept her chin parallel to the floor. She did not look away, but she didn't aggressively make eye contact either. She maintained a 1,000-yard stare, a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. She walked perfectly straight, refusing to favor her injured ribs, her boots clicking evenly on the linoleum floor. She grabbed a plastic brown tray. The smell of the food, powdered eggs, burnt bacon, and acidic black coffee made her stomach roll. Her jaw throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. Doc Stanton's voice echoed in her head. Soft chow for a week. She bypassed the hot food line entirely. She walked to the cold station, grabbed a small plastic bowl of lukewarm oatmeal and a bruised banana. She poured a cup of black coffee. She turned around. The entire room was still watching her. This was the crucible. This was the moment where the narrative would be cemented. If she took her tray back to her quarters, hiding in the dark to eat, she would validate their whispers. She would be the broken anomaly retreating from the pack. Cora walked directly to the center of the mess hall. She found an empty table, pulled out a metal chair, and sat down. She deliberately placed her tray squarely in front of her. She peeled the banana with slow, methodical precision. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. A few whispers broke out, sharp and frantic, but no one moved. Then a chair scraped loudly against the floorboards 3 tables away. Chief Gallagher stood up. He picked up his tray, which was piled high with eggs and sausage, and walked slowly across the room. The crowd watched him, breathless. Gallagher was old guard. He was the law on the FOB. Gallagher reached Cora's table. He didn't ask for permission. He just pulled out the chair directly across from her and dropped his tray with a loud, ringing clatter. He sat down, unfolded his paper napkin, and picked up a plastic fork. "Petty officer," Gallagher grunted, stabbing a piece of sausage. "Chief," Cora replied, her voice slightly muffled because she could barely open her mouth. Gallagher chewed slowly, his eyes scanning the room. He shot a lethal, withering glare at a table of young rangers who were staring too openly. Instantly, the rangers looked down at their plates. The spell broke. The low murmur of conversation slowly began to fill the room again, though the tension remained thick enough to cut with a knife. "You look like hell," Gallagher stated matter-of-factly, not looking at her face. "Feel like it too." Gallagher took a sip of his coffee, wincing at the bitter taste. He leaned forward slightly, resting his massive forearms on the table. The casual posture belied the absolute seriousness in his eyes. "I just came from Commander Briggs's office," Gallagher murmured. His voice dropping so low, Cora had to lean in slightly to hear him. The State Department handler has been having a meltdown since 0300, screaming into a satellite phone to his bosses in DC. Cora took a microscopic bite of her oatmeal. Swallowing was a chore. Did they file the JAG inquiry? Gallagher let out a short, rough laugh. It held absolutely no humor. File it, petty officer. They are actively burying it beneath so much classified red tape, it will take an act of God to ever unearth the incident report. Cora stopped chewing. She looked at him with her one good eye. What? You heard me, Gallagher said, wiping his mouth. The private military company isn't pressing charges. They aren't filing a formal complaint. In fact, they are officially stating that their men suffered injuries during a highly classified, late-night training exercise gone wrong. The sheer, monumental absurdity of it washed over Cora. They're lying to protect me. They aren't protecting you, Gallagher said, his voice hardening. They are protecting their stock price. They are protecting their fragile, bloated egos. You think a company that bills the government $4,000 a day per shooter wants it on the public record that 4 of their elite operators got put in the ICU by a single female SEAL? Gallagher shook his head slowly in disgust. The optics, Cora. The optics would ruin them. It would make them a laughingstock in the contractor community. They would lose their State Department contracts by Monday. Cora stared into her black coffee. The dark surface rippled slightly from the vibration of a passing truck. The system wasn't built to be fair. It was built to protect itself. She had been fully prepared to sacrifice her career on the altar of truth, to stand in front of a tribunal and defend her existence in the uniform. But the patriarchy was so deeply entrenched, so fundamentally terrified of its own weakness, that it would rather invent a lie than admit she had won. So what happens now? Cora asked, her voice flat and hollow. They are medevacing Hayes and Knox out in 30 minutes on a C-130 bound for Ramstein, Gallagher said. Davies and Miller are being reassigned to a low-visibility detail in Kuwait. They are gone. You never touch them. They never touch you. As far as the Navy is concerned, you slipped and fell during a night run, hence the bruised face. Cora felt a bitter, acidic laugh bubble up in her throat. It hurt her ribs to suppress it. I slipped and fell. You slipped and fell, Gallagher confirmed, his eyes locking onto hers. It's a dirty, cynical world, petty officer. Sometimes you don't get the shiny medal or the public vindication. Sometimes the victory is just watching the bastards run away. He picked up his tray, standing up from the table. You earned your space on this base last night. Nobody is going to touch your gear again. I can promise you that. Gallagher turned and walked away, leaving her alone at the table. Cora looked around the mess hall. The men were still glancing at her, but the looks had changed. It wasn't the zoo animal stare anymore. It was wary. It was calculating. It was fear. The flight line smelled of raw power and exhaust. The heat off the tarmac was already brutal, creating shimmering mirages that distorted the massive, grey silhouette of the C-130 Hercules cargo plane idling on the runway. The 4 massive turboprop engines whined with a deafening, bone-rattling intensity. Cora stood behind the chain-link fence, separating the motor pool from the airstrip. She had a pair of dark, tactical sunglasses pushed up on her nose, hiding her swollen eye and protecting her retinas from the blinding glare. She wasn't hiding. She had walked straight down the main thoroughfare of the base to get here. About 50 yards away, the loading ramp of the C-130 was down. A medical transport van was parked near the rear. Through the chain link, Cora watched the morning machinery operate. 2 airmen carried a stretcher up the ramp. Hayes. His head was wrapped in thick white gauze, his face completely obscured. He was heavily sedated, oblivious to the roaring engines. Next came Knox, He wasn't on a stretcher. He was walking, but he looked like a broken machine. He was flanked by the State Department civilian in the rumpled tan suit, who was furiously barking into a cell phone, trying to control the uncontrollable damage to his schedule. Knox walked with a heavy, shuffling limp. He wore civilian clothes now, a grey sweatshirt and sweatpants, stripped of his tactical armour and his unearned swagger. He held a thick, cervical collar wrapped tightly around his neck. As Knox reached the bottom of the cargo ramp, he paused. The State Department handler nudged him, but Knox didn't move. Slowly, painfully, the massive man turned his head. He looked past the ramp. He looked past the military police. He scanned the fence line, and he found her. Even at 50 yards, through the heat distortion and the chain-link fence, Cora felt the exact moment his eyes locked onto hers. She didn't move. She didn't wave. She didn't cross her arms to look tough. She just stood there, a solitary figure in a dust-covered uniform, battered but entirely unbroken. She let him look at the bruised face he had caused. She let him remember the exact sensation of his airway collapsing beneath her arm. Knox stared at her for a long, heavy moment. There was no hatred left in his posture. The bullying arrogance had been completely burned away, replaced by the hollow, haunted look of a man who had looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was faster, smarter, and infinitely more ruthless than he was. Knox slowly broke eye contact. He lowered his head, staring at the hot concrete, and shuffled up the ramp into the dark belly of the aircraft. The heavy hydraulic ramp whined, lifting slowly until it sealed shut with a massive, metallic clank. The C-130's engines pitched up into a screaming roar. The massive grey beast rolled down the runway, gathering speed until it finally tore free of the earth, banking hard to the west, disappearing into the blinding white sky. Cora watched the contrail fade. The silence on the ground slowly returned, filled only by the wind rattling the chain-link fence. She reached up and slowly pulled her sunglasses off, letting the harsh sunlight hit her bruised face. The pain in her jaw was a steady, rhythmic thrum. The ache in her ribs was a permanent companion. She turned away from the flight line and began the long walk back toward the armory. The internal contradiction that had plagued her for 3 years was gone. She finally understood the game. She had spent so long trying to prove she was equal to the men around her, trying to match their cadence, trying to earn their respect through quiet suffering and immaculate professionalism. She realized now that equality was a myth sold to the naive. In the brutal calculus of this world, you were either the predator or the prey. They had taken her weapon because they thought she was prey. They thought her gender made her soft. They thought the trident pinned to her chest was a piece of political jewelry. They were wrong. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need their respect. She didn't even need the truth on an incident report. The truth was written in the shattered cartilage and bruised egos of 4 elite contractors currently fleeing the continent. She was a SEAL, not a female SEAL, not an initiative, not a social experiment. She was the ghost in their machine. She was the violent, inevitable consequence of underestimating the quiet one in the room. And as she walked back into the suffocating dust of the forward operating base, every operator, every Marine, every mechanic who saw her step aside to let her pass. They didn't speak to her. They didn't have to. 79 seconds was all it took to change the world. Did you love this brutal, uncompromising dive into the realities of elite operators? If Cora's ruthless takedown of a toxic system had your heart racing, smash that like button right now. Drop a comment below. Did she do the right thing by taking the silent victory? Or should she have fought the bureaucracy? Don't forget to share this story with someone who appreciates a gritty, realistic underdog tale. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into combat, tactics, and the true cost of wearing the uniform. Stay frosty and see you next time.